Everyone, let's get started. It's time for us to get started. It's great to have with us Mr. David Beasley, Executive Director of WFP, as our guest speaker. Before assuming the post of the Executive Director in 2017, he had served as the member of the South Carolina House of Representatives and Governor of the U.S. state of South Carolina. WFP was awarded Nobel Peace Prize back in 2017. Please refer to his biography in English, which we've distributed to you. He has addressed the Japan National Press Club back in December 2017 when he assumed the post. He is on his way back from the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Bali after stopping by Thailand. He is now in Japan. At G20, he wore a tie when he was here the last time. Drought, climate change, and no COVID, and Russian invasion of Ukraine, and deteriorating situation of food situation around the world. He will discuss. We will have simultaneous interpretation between Japanese and English, and I would like to invite Mr. Beasley to talk about 15 minutes. And we will have an exchange of views with those who are joining us online and in person. And he will be addressing our questions, entertaining our questions through a quarter to 3. And we have questions that can be addressed. For those of you who want to ask their questions online, please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. I will call on you during the Q&A session. For those of you who want to send your questions in text, please use the Q&A box. Please state your name and affiliation and questions. And the questions from the Q&A can be sent right now. And I'll be serving as the MC. I'm Saki OUCHI, Yomiuri Shimbun, and we have interpreters, Ms. Kaoru IKEDA and Ms. Tatae AKIYAMA, Simul International.
I tweeted evidently yesterday, and there's that tie. That's the tie that I received here a couple of years ago. So, and it was a very nice tie. So thank you very much. It's great to be back. I think the best thing for me to do today is to help paint a picture of the reality that we're facing around the world today. When a nation such as Ukraine that grows enough food to feed 400 million people, when that food is taken off the market, what do you think is going to happen? Obviously, it's going to have a devastating impact on global food supply. Before Ukraine, I had already been expressing grave concerns to the world leaders that we were facing the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. When I took this job 5.5 years ago, there were 80 million people marching, as we would say, towards starvation. That would be IPC level 3, 4, 5. That's different than chronic hunger. Chronic hunger was 650 million. Now it's over 810. 200 years ago, to give you some historical perspective, 95% of the people on Earth, a world population of a little over 1 billion, 95% of the people were in extreme poverty. We've been able to reduce that extreme poverty to less than 10%. And we have been reducing hunger around the world, especially in the last 50 years, because of systems and programs put in place by nations like Japan, the United States, and others around the world. So great progress was, in fact, being made. But the last few years, we're going backwards. So as I said, when I took this role, there were 80 million people marching to starvation. When I say that, that means they don't know where the next meal is necessary coming from. They're struggling to get food. That number went from 80 million to 135 right before COVID. And the question, why did it go up then? The simple answer is man-made conflict compounded with climate shocks around the world. This is pre-COVID. COVID comes on the scene with economic devastation, especially among the poorest of the poor nations. And the number goes from 135 million people to 276 million people. This is pre-Ukraine. That number rose strictly because of the economic devastation of COVID. During that period, we were able to avert famine, avert destabilization of nations, and avert mass migration because, as I appealed to the world leaders at the beginning of COVID, very clearly, you cannot make decisions about COVID in a vacuum. Otherwise, the cure will be worse than the disease. We have to balance a hunger pandemic along with a COVID pandemic. And we did that. Nations around the world, like Japan, stepped up in unprecedented ways for support, and especially for the poorest of the poor countries that were so devastated. Now, during that time period, there was over $28 trillion of economic stimulus packages put in place to help reverberate the economy, to kick it back into gear. Poor nations went into greater debt for safety net programs so that people would not starve, and so there would be safety net programs, and there would not be destabilization and famine and mass migration. And we partnered with over 100 nations around the world. However, we thought that COVID would be behind us by the end of 2021, only to see it recycle and recycle again and again. Countries, nations, donor nations have exhausted their supplies in terms of monies for safety net programs. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, you had Afghanistan on top of Ethiopia and Yemen and Syria. And then the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine, that grows enough grain to feed over 400 million people, and Ukraine and Russia together, enough to feed, well, grow 30% of the world's supply of wheat, 20% of the world's supply of maize, corn, and 75 to 80% of the world's supply of sunflower cooking oil. So the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine, is now the longest bread lines of the world. Now the number, because of the Ukraine war, has spiked from 276 million people to 345 million people. The most troubling breakdown of that number is that out of that 345, 50 million people in 45 countries are knocking on famine's door. If you want to know which countries have highest prospects of famine and destabilization and mass migration, start with those 45. If you recall back in 2007 and 8, with the food crisis then, there were over 48 nations that had civil riots, protests, political unrest. And the economic factors today are much worse than they were back then. We are already seeing riots and protests take place in Peru, Pakistan, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Kenya. You've already seen destabilizing factors take place in Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali. These are only signs of things to come because it's only going to get worse. You're facing a pricing problem right now. But next year, you very well will face a availability problem. 2007 and 8, the biggest crisis was on rice. You haven't heard the world talk about the rice problem yet. Why? Because the fertilizer problem is just now surfacing. So just when you think it can't get any worse, where does most of your base product for fertilizer comes from? Russia and Belarus. Already, the African Development Bank is projecting that in Africa alone, they need $2 billion more to fill in the fertilizer gap, if they can get it, if they can afford it. And just FYI, Africa has a population of about 1.4 billion people. There are 33 million smallholder farms in Africa that feed 70% of the population. 70% of the population of 1.4 billion is about 980 million people. We feed at the World Food Program 130 million people around the world. Half of that is in Africa. So out of the 1.4 billion, we are feeding only 65 million. Out of that 980 million, we're only feeding 65 million. So what do you think is going to happen when they don't get the fertilizers they need? Countries around the world are facing droughts and a fertilizer crisis, a fuel crisis, a food crisis. So we have a perfect storm of conflict, climate and COVID, the 3 C's and the 3 F's, food, fuel, fertilizers, all coming together for a perfect storm within a perfect storm. At the World Food Program, we buy about 50% of the grain that we do buy from Ukraine. Already, the devastating economic expense on World Food Program because of increased pricing of food, fuel, and shipping costs is already $70 million more per month on our operational bottom line expense. So just to break even, we need $850 additional million. Over 36 nations around the world depend upon Ukraine and Russia for over 50% of their grain. Over 26 nations or dozens of nations around the world depend upon 50% or more for fertilizer from like Russia, Mozambique, or Sierra Leone, or Guatemala, Honduras. You can imagine the impact. The African Development Bank projects that there will be $11 billion reduction of food harvesting this coming year, or this coming harvest. So you can begin to see how fragile the system is. You begin to see how volatile the market is. This is why, since the beginning of the war, I have been speaking as loud as I possibly can about the port of Odessa being opened up. Failure to open up the port of Odessa is nothing less than a declaration of war against food security at a time that we least needed such. I've asked President Putin, regardless of your views of Ukraine, please do not impose famine upon the rest of the world. Let's open up these ports, give safe passageway for the grains to reach people around the world. This alone will not solve the problems, but it will begin to ease the volatility in the marketplace. That, along with other solutions, we can begin a pathway back to food security. We are gravely concerned because of the lack of funding. As you can imagine, we were reaching 130 million people. Now the needs are so great. We are in a position now to take food from hungry children to give to starving children. We have already, for example, in Yemen, a nation of about 30, give or take, million people, we feed about 13 million. 5 million of those people, we've already cut 50% rations. 8 million, we're now cutting down 2/3 of their rations, gone. Sudan, South Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali. I can keep going around the world. I've made excessive pleas to world leaders. I have ventured and spent tremendous amount of time in the United States in the past month and a half, meeting with the Democrat and Republican leaders of the Senate and the House. And fortunately, though they seem to be fighting over everything and anything, they laid aside their differences when it came to food security and passed a special package of $5 billion extra dollars, most of which will go to the World Food Program. Having said that, other nations are stepping up in ways they have not done before, recognizing that if you don't, it's going to cost you 1,000 times more. If we don't meet the needs of the people where they are, you will have famine, starvation, you will have destabilization of nations, you will have mass migration, and the cost is 1,000 times more. Japan is stepping up in ways that it never has before. Already this year, 228 million for Ukraine, 68 million for emergency operations. Last year, I think 221 million. Is that about right? Give or take. Unprecedented. This year, I expect that to be more. The reason I am here is several reasons. One, to thank the people of Japan for their extraordinary support of feeding the poorest of the poor around the world, number one. Number two, to say this year we've got to do more. It's critical. We have seen in the past, let me give you a very simple example, like in the Syrian war, failure to address root cause before it was too late. We can feed a Syrian in Syria for about 50 cents on a day. And by the way, people just don't leave home without extraordinary reason. When you feed 130 million people like we do, we survey them all the time. And people don't want to leave home. But if they don't have food or any degree of peace, they would do what any mother or father would do for their children. And we've seen it from country by country by country, but just the example of Syria alone, people would move 2, 3, 4 times in their home country before they would eventually move to Lebanon or Jordan or Germany or Brussels or wherever. To support a Syrian in Berlin, the humanitarian support package is about $70 per day versus 50 cents a day. $125 billion over 5 years for 1 million refugees who did not want to leave home. You see, you're going to pay for it one way or the other. It's just a lot cheaper and a lot better for everybody if we meet the needs of the people at their home. So we are in an unprecedented crisis. Now, let me add, because this is one thing that I have really been, maybe hard might be the right word, on leaders around the world. My goal at the World Food Program when I arrived was to put the World Food Program out of business. How do we help people in need such that they can grow their own food, take care of their own families, and no longer need us? If we were given the flexibility to do resilience work like we believe is necessary, when a shock like Ukraine does happen, it has a much less devastating impact versus just giving food, giving food, giving food. To give you some semblance of what I'm talking about, for example, in the last 5 or 6 years, when we are given the flexibility with funds like from Japan, we have, with our beneficiaries, rehabilitated over 1.4 million hectares of land that otherwise was growing nothing. But working with the beneficiaries, that land is now producing food for people, or maybe food for animals. We're in the poorest of the poor economies and cultures in the world that are paying the price for climate change. And they're the ones that are working the hardest to green it back up. We dug over 107,000 holding ponds and wells and reservoirs, over 81,000 kilometers of roads, feeder roads, to get food to the market, over 26,000 kilometers of irrigation canals. And I could go on and on. And when you go to these communities, when a shock happens, the impact is nominal. So this is why in the future, as we go forward, we must rethink how we approach food security globally, so the poorest of the poor countries are not so devastated when these types of shocks take place. But what we're facing right now is an unprecedented crisis, unlike anything I've ever seen, for certain in my lifetime. And let me repeat, over the next 6 to 12 months, you will have a food pricing problem, as you're seeing and witnessing around the world. And next year, we expect there to be a food availability problem. Let me also add, because it breaks my heart, I've messaged many of my close friends here in Japan. When I was at the G20 in meetings day before yesterday with the foreign minister, whom we'll be meeting with just after this. Former Prime Minister Abe was a great friend of not just the World Food Program, but food security. He understood the importance of global food security, and our funding with former Prime Minister was tremendous. He was a great ally, a great friend, and our commitment will bear his spirit going forward. And so we're so thankful for his leadership, and we will not let his spirit die. And so let me stop right there. I usually speak faster, but I was trying to slow it down for my Southern dialect of the United States. I hope you can understand what I'm saying. So let me stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beasley. So we'll go to questions and answers session. まず会場からのご質問を受け付けます。
We would like to take questions from those of you who are in person. Please proceed to either of the two microphones in the hall, and please state your name and affiliation before asking your questions. Degawa-san.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My name is Nobuhisa Degawa, commentator of NHK Japan Broadcasting Corporation. My question will be in Japanese, please.
At the moment, we are witnessing the food crisis, and there are different causes, and this is unprecedented, and there are multiple causes behind the crisis that we are witnessing. The war in Ukraine, if we were to focus on that, the international community at the moment, the parties to the conflict, and the international organizations and governments around the world, what are the steps required of them to take in order to forestall hunger and famine? And what are the steps needed for them to take in order to reduce the number of those who die from hunger? Of course, ending conflict is a major solution. However, it will take time to achieve truce or ceasefire. So apart from that, what is required of the international community to lessen this crisis, ameliorate this lesson? That is the question. Thank you.
So let me answer this question. Many things. Number one is open up the Odessa ports. That's critical. Number two, substantial new funding to get through these next 2 years. Three is countries should resist protectionism and keep the trade flowing between borders. Fourth is I have been talking to ministers of foreign affairs, ministers of agriculture from nations around the world. You must reevaluate all your policies on a short-term basis to increase food production. I would hope that at the end of the year, we could say, oh, we were wrong and there's too much food. To be at the end of the year and say you had too much food is a nice problem. To be at the end of the year and not have enough food, well, you can only imagine what will happen in the streets of any developed nation, much less poor nation, as we've seen in the past. So each country leadership knows its strengths and weaknesses, knows what it can do and should do, know how much land has been set aside that needs to be revisited on a short-term basis. We are not advising countries about their own particular uniqueness, because the agricultural ministers and the leaders of the country, they know. Also, we're asking leaders to do everything they can to maximize the flow of fertilizers, which is critical. Sanctions do not apply to food nor fertilizers. And so therefore these sanctions, banks, insurance companies, et cetera, need to do everything they can to assure that this trade, this supply chain is not disrupted, because it has been and is disrupted as we speak. It is one of the greatest requests I get from governments today is they need fertilizers and need fertilizers. We're not in the fertilizer business, but we can help use our office as a bully pulpit, so to speak, a voice to let the private sector know where there are great needs, and et cetera, et cetera. So those are just a few ideas right there.
会場から次の質問。
Anyone who are attending in person, next questions, please.
どうぞ。
Yes. Please use the microphone. GG Press. Saki is my name. I have two questions. First, as you've just mentioned, Japan has funding, and what are the financial and humanitarian support are you asking for Japan? I would like to find out the details of your request to Japan. Second, when will the food prices peak? If you have any assumption, I would like to know when the food prices could peak.
If I heard that right, when do we think the food prices will peak? Yeah.
Food prices.
I can't tell you the answer to that question. It's not going to peak anytime soon enough. I do not think this is going to be a 6-month problem. I think it's going to be a multi-year problem. But if we don't get on top of it now, it will be a years upon years problem. If we don't get on top of it now, the devastation could be cataclysmic, particularly with a world that is very fragile economically right now. My request to Japan is very simple. Thank you for what you've done. You now must step up in ways you've never done before. The world needs Japan's leadership and financial support to help stabilize the rest of the world. I anticipate Japan stepping up with the United States, Germany, France, and other countries to get us through these next couple of years.
For those of you who are joining us online, I would like to read out your questions. Nikkei Asia, Ruriko Imahashi has this question. Due to the war in Ukraine, the supply of fertilizer, there are a lot of uncertainties there. Many countries in Asia could also face difficulties in unstable supply of fertilizers, and this could have implications on rice production. The uncertainty around the supply of fertilizer, what would be the degree of implications that could have on the staple food in Asia?
I think the question was the impact of lack of fertilizer on
rice in Asia.
On rice.
Yeah.
If you remember, it was pretty tough in 2007 and 2008. I think it's going to be much worse. And that'll be in the spring of next year. As we look into this harvest season for the fall, the fertilizers are just not out there. This is why the world leaders have got to focus. Well, number one, they need to end the war, but until that happens, they need to focus on making certain that fertilizers reach nations in need. And that's every nation that I know of. Because so far we've been talking about the problems that basically in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and to some degree, Central America. But Asia is going to be pounded with this fertilizer crisis. It's going to devastate rice harvest over the next 12 months. And when you look at how much progress has been made on reducing hunger in the world, it's been primarily in Asia. And this could truly set back global food security beyond anything that we've imagined so far with the Africa, Middle East, and European crisis. There's just no reason, there's nothing positive in taking a chance here. This is why I'm asking leaders right now, you don't have enough money to do everything. You've got to prioritize right now. It's like, I'd say, icebergs out in front of the Titanic. Should you be really worried about a broken wine glass in the bar right now? A broken piece of tile in the toilet? I know those aren't nice things, but compared to icebergs, so leaders have got to prioritize the icebergs, the critical matters that impact global security. And we know food security impacts global security. Without food, there will not be peace. That is why the Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarded the World Food Program the Nobel Peace Prize laureate 2 years ago, because they clearly were saying thank you to the World Food Program for what you've done. But I also think they had a message of prophecy. Worse things are coming. Wake up, world. This is before Ukraine. This is before Afghanistan. Actually, this is before Ethiopia. So I am very worried about the next 2 years. But If we are given the funds that we need, we will avert famine in a timely fashion. We will avert destabilization of nations and mass migration by necessity, as we have done in the past few years. But we need those monies quickly so that we can move supplies quickly. And many of you probably do know, but we don't just deliver food, we also deliver cash-based systems. Where there are supply chain systems operating, we do cash so we can help stimulate local economies, like in Africa, for example, to help the smallholder farmers, et cetera. And so there are many places around the world where if we're given the cash, we can stimulate local economies quickly. But if it's in-kind contribution where we're buying grain, you don't move grain from the field to the port to a nation in Africa overnight. That doesn't happen that quick. So this is why we must move quickly in nations where we have to have grain so we can move it quickly. For example, to move grain from the United States to Yemen, that's several months. We know we've got money now coming to Yemen, but I don't have grain just sitting in warehouses in Yemen. You see, the supply chain system is extremely important here, and the supply chain system has been disrupted because of Ukraine. Many nations around the world struggling to get the grains they need, or they're having to pay exorbitant pricing. As you're seeing, for example, in countries like Egypt, Lebanon, over 80% of their grain wheat comes from Ukraine, Russia, 80%. The devastation that is already having, and we're using our purchase power to be able to help nations acquire the grains that they need.
A related question from Mr. Hiroki Sugita of Kyoto News Agency. WFP あるいはビーズリーさん
WFP or yourself negotiating with Russia to unblock Black Sea. Have you requested, you yourself or WFP? If that has been an attempt, what has been the reaction by Russia for now?
I think I heard the question right about, I have written and spoken to the leadership in Russia about how critical it is to open up the ports in the Odessa region. I might be overly optimistic, but I am hopeful that we can have a breakthrough in the next couple of weeks. To me, it's honestly, it's not complicated. It's either you let the ships flow or you don't. And I've asked you as a UN, let's don't overcomplicate this matter. Let's get those ports open. Let's get those ships moving. Now, having said that, I do understand when I talk to Ukraine about this, and I've been to Ukraine multiple times, and I've been to Odessa port, meeting with leaders, and you can imagine even while we're there, missiles are flying overhead, and that's just not many people realize 80% of our operations are in war zones, in war areas. So we're used to delivering food in the most complex environments. And so as I was talking to the Ukrainian military, who expressed their grave concern about demining the ports out of fear that Russia would invade. And I said, let me be very clear. If you don't get the grains flowing, when you look at the economic factors of Ukraine pre-war, I don't remember the exact number, but between 40 and 50% of their economy's GDP is based upon port activity. Over 40% of that's agriculture alone. So if Russia doesn't fire another shot, but just keeps the ports blocked, you have an economic collapse coming. There's no way. So as I said to the Ukrainian military, you got to get these ports open. Otherwise, you're done. And I said, and more importantly, the whole world pays a big price. And so, as you can imagine, the practicality, because Ukraine, when we say they grow enough food to feed 400 million people, they grow between 90 and 110 million metric tons of grain per year. Give or take, 60% of that, give or take, is exported. 90% of all that which is exported goes through those ports. So the entire infrastructure supply chain is based upon trains to the ports. On average, on a normal day, there would be over 3,000 train carloads per day being unloaded in those ports, then fill in the big silos. Well, one train carload is 3 to 4 truck loads. You can't truck out enough of the country. You can't mathematically do it. We're working on that. We're trucking out everything we possibly can. We're working on alternative routes, but do the math. If you export normally 60 million metric tons, that's 5 million metric tons a month. At best, we can export by truck 1 million, 1.5 million metric tons. And we're working on a lot of different options there. But now, and so you can imagine if you've got 3,000 train carloads per day, how you get 10,000 trucks per day when trucks are already backed up from miles and miles and days upon days to enter in and out of Ukraine and the war zone. It just won't work. So you got to get the ports. Now, because the train system, the ports aren't operational, silos aren't being emptied. You got the next harvest coming up this month and next month. Where is that grain going? The production is going to be down anyway because of the war, which impacts the global food supply. But if they do grow enough, and we do expect them to grow enough to fill the vacancy within the silos we have now, but there's going to be, I think, about 20 million metric. This is a nebulous number, but somewhere around 20 million metric tons, there's no place for it to go at the rate we're unloading silos as fast as we can. So that's going to have to just rot in the field or be burned, which doesn't even begin to address the next harvest of maize in the fall. This is why I've been telling the leaders on this Odessa port, even if we can put up some temporary silos, you're kicking the can down the road. You can't do this for the next couple of years. We need to, it's showtime. And I mean, it's showtime. It's time for Russia, Ukraine, and the international community to resolve this port issue once and for all right now. I think that gives you a little bit of a mathematical understanding of some of the issues with regards to those ports that we're talking about. I could spend a lot of time on that, but anyway, that's probably enough at this moment. So anyway, the bottom line is, yes, I'm begging Russia, Ukraine, the international community to come up with solutions now.
会場から最後の質問
This is going to be the last question, and I'm asking those in person.
Thank you, Mr. Beasley. I'm a Japanese journalist from Shimbun. My name is Tatsuya Sato. Sorry for speaking in Japanese. すいません。先ほどあった質問に関連
A
するんです。
follow-up on the previous question. Mr. Beasley, you said that you have been asking President Putin to open up port of Odessa. To be more specific, when did you talk to him? And where did you talk to him? Under what circumstances? And what was the response by President Putin? I know this was a part of your previous question, but I would very much appreciate your response to that.
clear letters to Moscow. That, I don't remember the date. I can get the date for you. I want to think it was maybe a month after, it could have been 6 weeks, give or take. But how long has the war been going on now? It's from February 28th, give or take, February 20th. I can't remember the exact date. So March, April, May, June. So I would say 2 months at most into the war, we've been making requests. Now, I have met with other Russian leaders to discuss. I talked with Lavrov about this in Bali at the G20. He and I had an extensive conversation just the other day. I walked away cautiously optimistic that, but as I said to not just him, everybody involved, this really isn't that complicated. You know, it's just either you're going to do it or not. You're either going to let them operate, and you know, and the more obstacles you throw up, and to me indicates there's no seriousness. That's why I said failure to open up these ports is a declaration of war. It's a declaration of war on global food security. There'll be hopefully some meetings taking place in the next, what's today? Monday.
Today's the 11th.
I would hope there's some meetings, there's discussions taking place as we speak in the next few days. Let me leave it at that. We are prepared to do whatever we need to do to encourage a solution.
Could I just ask for clarification? You expect this meeting to take place between WFP and the Russians?
No, not. There's a lot of discussions taking place, as you can imagine, behind the scenes as we speak. But there'll be, I'm trying to recall, not having any sleep, what's already been said publicly, what hasn't been said publicly. I don't want to say something that's not out, that's not ready to be said publicly yet. But I know there should be another round of Istanbul talks moving forward soon, in the very near future, that would involve, I think, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, and the UN will be participating in those. The exact date and time is not set. I hope I don't regret saying this. But so anyway, and there's a lot of discussions taking place, as you can imagine. And there's a lot of, you can imagine, a lot of African leaders are calling Putin. They're saying, look, we need food, we need fertilizers. And, you know, so there's a lot of big pressure. I know private sector around the world, private sector inside Russia, private sector that supply chains with regards to fertilizers and food. This is it's a very difficult, very delicate issue. You know, food's, you can't live without food. You know, you can go without a car for a week or a month. You know, it might be inconvenient, but you go without food and this is what one of my gravest concerns. Let's say we get enough food to keep everybody alive, but I'm taking food from hungry children to give to starving children. What do you think is going to be the stunting rate and the wasting rate? The malnutrition is going to be so unprecedented, and the impact on those children for the future of those nations is going to just be devastating. It's not just, yes, it is about getting enough food to keep people alive, but it's also about getting enough food to keep children healthy so they can learn and have a brighter future. We all know what happens when children don't, at the critical early years, don't get the nutrition they need. They're not just vulnerable to disease of COVID and malaria and diphtheria and cholera. They're vulnerable to, you know, intellectual development and life itself. And so anyway.
ビーズリーさん、今日は
Mr. Beasley, I know your schedule is very tight. Thank you very much for sparing time out of your very busy schedule to be with us this afternoon. So with that, we would like to adjourn the press conference. Thank you so much, Mr. Beasley.